This explosive narrative is titled, "The Kings Must Be Crazy," Part 1. King Nebuchadnezzar stood at the foot of the cross, his heart pounding like a talking drum. His faith wavered for the first time. Was his God actually stolen? Or did he jump from the dried idolatry and ran away? Fear spread through the palace like wildfire. Guards swore they had seen nothing. They searched every corner, but the body was nowhere to be found. In the king's mind, one thought clawed its way to the surface. This was no ordinary theft. Something strange, far more powerful, was at play. The villagers whispered that the Mother Earth had taken the god to punish King Nebuchadnezzar. The palace was alive with fear and whispers, whispers from the earth itself. The palace guards, armed and watchful, stood frozen. They had no explanation for what they saw. The giant wooden cross in the center of the king's palace, where the figure of Jesus had always hung, was empty. The body was gone. No one saw who had taken it. No one heard a sound. The night was very much alive at the palace, like every other night. The last of the king's guests left early enough in the company of his two bodyguards. It rained around the middle of the night, but not much. And no other person visited the palace till this morning. So who could have scaled the high fence at the palace unnoticed to carry away the human-sized statue that was dedicated by Bishop Clement? Without the consent of the king, few members of the Council of Elders gathered in the sacred grove to seek answers for the worrisome omen. 6 or 7 of them, those who still had reverence to the land. They brought cola nuts as they sat, before proceeding to discuss the reason for their emergency gathering. The eldest of them who broke the cola nut shivered as he threw the broken lobes into a round wooden tray. The pattern which the lobes formed in the tray was strange, unlike anything the elders had ever seen. This is a warning," the elderly cabinet member whispered. The men did not eat the cola nut, instead, left in a hurry just as they entered. It was very difficult for Ono, a senior cabinet member who has the ears of the king, to convince King Nebuchadnezzar to invite a dibia. The king, a proud man who had converted to Christianity years ago, dismissed the elders' warnings. "These are mere superstitions," he said. "Our faith in the one true God will protect us." "I don't think it's mere superstition, Your Highness," Onowu canvassed. "The land is still potent, even with all these defilement." King Nebuchadnezzar's pride finally crumbled into fear, and against his beliefs he summoned a Sirikoko, the most revered dibia in the land. And to avoid public outrage, he insisted on secrecy. The moves must not be made public. Onowu had agreed, in line with the dictates of the king. But when the dibia was brought to the palace, he insisted that any divination over the strange occurrence must be made by sunrise on Eek Market Day. "It must be done in the open, where all may see," a Sirikoko declared. "If you think you can cover the moon with your bare hands, go ahead." King Nebuchadnezzar was mad with the dibia. He stopped short of ordering the palace guards to flog him, but gave orders that the man should be chased away and not to be seen again around the palace. The decision not to allow public divination was one which King Nebuchadnezzar made with firm resolve. He could not let the whispers of the old gods disrupt his reign or challenge his new faith. Pot-bellied Igwes, or kings in Igbo land, who were made the custodians of Igbo tradition and culture, have become harbingers of foreign creed. Many of these kings would never know that one-man rulership in Igbo land was an accident in people's history. Kings practically walked out of themselves by way of miseducation or greed. The likes of Nebuchadnezzar consciously became agents of their own destruction. King Nebuchadnezzar had hijacked the throne with the power of his wealth. He gave so much money to bookmen and to anyone who had a voice to speak against his gamble for the throne. People lost their integrity, and those who had no integrity in the first place collected money and became errand men to King Nebuchadnezzar. A Sirioka was ordered out of his palace for dreaming of casting his divination beads at the foot of the Roman cross. The dibia went his way, but the wrath of Mother Earth, it seemed, was relentless. And it came to pass, King Nebuchadnezzar and his people knew no peace. Strange things began to happen. The guards spoke of feeling an unseen presence watching them. Beyond the palace walls, the community experienced even more alarming phenomena. Rivers turned murky, emitting a foul stench that drove away fish and made the water undrinkable. The strangest and most terrifying of all were the sleepless nights that plagued them. People heard rhythmic hums from the earth beneath their homes, a sound that grew louder as the days passed. Children fell ill with mysterious fevers. And whenever the elders consulted their divination tools, they found patterns they could not interpret, shapes that seemed to speak of doom. Desperation grew as the once thriving village fell into chaos, and all eyes turned to the king, whose decision to drive away Asirikoko has remained unrevoked. One moonless night, messengers arrived from a neighboring village. 3 of them, one was carrying a basket, just the way 3 wise men had visited the king with gifts. They had brought news from Obeledu, the village of the king's daughter, Adazi, who had been married off only a year earlier. One of the wise men stammered as he relayed the events. Adizai had given birth to a child, but the child was no ordinary infant. The palace fell silent as the messenger described the newborn. The baby had the frail body of an old man, a bald head with wisps of white hair, and a mustache that curled unnaturally. Its eyes are very scary, as if they had seen spirits. The midwives swore the child did not cry at birth, but laughed at them mockingly. Adasia is still at hospital, but she demanded that the newborn be brought to the king. The moment Nebuchadnezzar set eyes on the infant, his composure shattered. His trembling hands gripped the arms of his throne as he stared at the creature that was supposed to be his grandchild. The palace trembled in chaos. Elders who were seated with the king rejected the bad omen with disagreeing shakes of the head. The queen rose to her feet, her face a mask of rage and grief. "This can never be my grandchild," she cried. "This is a curse, and you, my husband, have brought it upon us." Nebuchadnezzar, still shaking, tried to defend himself. "This is not my doing," he muttered. But the queen was unrelenting. "Your refusal to do the needful has brought this doom. If you do not act now, the vengeance of Mother Earth will consume us all." The queen's outburst sent ripples of unease through the palace. The king, humiliated and desperate, called for a private council with his trusted guards and advisors. They suggested sending the child away, hiding the truth from the people. But the queen would not hear of it. "If you do not invite Asirikoko to the palace right away," she said, her voice rising, "I will leave this palace and take my people with me. I will tell the entire kingdom of your cowardice. You are a traditional ruler in Igbo land, my husband, not a mayor in any of the cities in Rome." The king's pride wrestled with his fear, but he knew he could not afford to lose the queen's support. Her lineage held great sway over the people, and her defiance would spark rebellion. After a long, sleepless night, Nebuchadnezzar called for Asirikoko and gave his consent for the divination to take place in the open, at the feet of the cross. Villagers gathered in tense anticipation before the dibia arrived. The whole news was circulating even as the king tried to seal people's lips. Asirikoko was a man of great renown, feared and respected across the land. His arrival this time to the palace was marked by the sound of a talking drum and the scent of burning herbs. His eyes, sharp and ancient, surveying the palace as though he could see the unseen. The villagers began to murmur, their fear growing. The king's guards exchanged uneasy glances. And somewhere, in the heart of the forest, the mournful hymns rose again, louder this time, as if the forest itself was crying for what had been lost. The king followed the dibia with his eyes, his Christian faith warring with the fear that now ruled his heart. The queen stood beside the king, her presence a reminder that the consequence of inaction would be far greater than any perceived loss of power. The queen had had enough. She remembered the days of the old which her late father used to talk about. Igbo people had lived in perfect harmony with nature, the land, the sky, and their ancestors. The earth was alive under their feet, its rhythms matching their heartbeats. Rivers flowed clear and cool, and the forest whispered secrets to those who listened. The people respected Ani, the earth goddess, and followed her divine laws. They farmed only what they needed, never taking more than the land could give. Their connection with the ancestors equally strong. Each family had an ancestral temple where they left offerings of kola nut and palm wine for their holy ancestors. When a child was born, they were believed to carry the spirit of an ancestor, returning to guide the living. Wisdom flowed through the people, passed down through proverbs and songs, each word a gift from the past. The Igbo people had long known the elements: earth, fire, water, and air as their allies. Each element had its role in the delicate dance of life, and the people respected their power. But this balance was breaking. Signs of rebellion began to spread across the land. The river, once a source of life, turned turbulent and unfriendly. It overflowed its banks without warning, sweeping away crops and homes. The earth is weary with cracks. Entire sections of land caved in overnight, swallowing compounds and leaving deep, silent voids. The air also grew heavy and unnatural. Winds tore through villages at random, uprooting sacred trees and scattering thatched roofs like leaves. People struggled to breathe, the very air they depended on turning oppressive. Even fire betrayed them. Flames refused to ignite or burn uncontrollably, devouring entire storerooms and farmlands. People were terrified and confused. They were not just battling against elements, but against themselves too. Religion tore them apart. Miseducation made them who they are not, and misrule held them to their knees. The resultant hardship made them enemies of one another. Criminality thrived. Kidnappers invade people's home and snatch human beings to demand for ransom afterwards. The elders, once confident in their wisdom, could no longer interpret the signs. They foolishly taught the young ones that the easiest way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Medicine men desperate for wealth venture into sacred forests, but no longer hear the whispers of plants. And so, food and medicines brought into Igbo land came from those who do not wish well for a people. The villagers began to argue. Some blamed the elders for their greed and neglect to the sacred laws. Others accused the younger generation of laziness and disrespect. The once united community splintered further as fear and mistrust consumed them. The people began to realize that their survival depended on restoring the balance, but no one knew how. They enthusiastically hoped that the disappearance of a foreign statue from the king's palace would mean disappearance of their agony. It was Eek market day, just as the sun was rising. The villagers packed themselves at the palace. A Sirikoko walked in with fresh palm frond, tightly clenched between his lips. He must no greet or accept greetings from anyone. The air was heavy with anticipation, and even the birds seemed to hold their songs. A Sirikoko, dressed in his white ritual cloth, carried a small bag containing his divination tools. His face was calm, yet his eyes bore evidence of generations of spiritual wisdom. A Sirikoko sat right in front of the empty cross and carefully spread a white cloth on the ground. The cloth, pristine and unblemished, symbolized a clean connection to the spiritual realm. As he smoothed out the edges, he murmured quiet prayers to forces that only he knows, and to Annie, the earth goddess, asking for their presence and guidance. The villagers watched in silence, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. The Dibia untied a bundle of divination strings from his bag, each adorned with small beads and charms. He laid them next to each other on the white cloth, whispering words of power into them. From his bag, a Sirikoko pulled out a small piece of enzu, the sacred chalk. He held it up to the sky and spoke words of invocation, his voice steady and firm. Then, with a slow motion, he drew 4 vertical lines on the cloth, between the strings. He touched both palms and legs with the white chalk, and with same slow motion, drew a circle around his eyes. A Sirikoko's brows wrinkled abruptly as he maintained a steady gaze. "The spirits are restless," he said, his voice low but audible enough to send a ripple through the crowd. The Dibia brought out a kola nut, large and brown, and presented it to the gathering. "Let us call on the ancestors to guide us," he said. He turned the kola nut in his hands, muttering prayers in Igbo, before breaking it open. The nut split into 4 clean lobes. A murmur of relief swept through the villagers. 4 lobes, a Sirikoko announced, a sign that Ezumezu are at alert, the ancestors are listening. As the sanctification ceremony ended with the breaking of the kola nut, a Sirikoko threw a lobe to the unseen, threw one into his mouth and offered a piece to the king. With that, the Dibia pulled up the strings, each of his hands holding 2 strings. He held them in his hands for a moment, whispering power into them. Then, with a fluid motion, he cast the strings onto the cloth. The strings fell in a crisscross pattern, with one string standing apart, almost as if pointing toward the king. A Sirikoko studied the arrangement in silence, his eyes tracing the lines and intersections. He spoke in a language that no one understood, nodding slowly at intervals. Again he pulled the four-string up and spoke in high tone. It seemed he was having a dialogue with an unseen individual in front of him or with the empty wooden cross. He finished his conversation and threw the strings over the white cloth again with same smooth motion. The strings fell again in an overlapping pattern. One string stood apart this time, pointing directly toward the king. Asirikoko looked up at the king. "The spirits speak clearly," he said. "The balance has been broken. The land is angry with you for snatching one of her sacred daughter. You must make amends, or the community will continue to suffer." The king's face darkened with a mix of disbelief and terror, his mind racing. Memories of his ascent to throne returned, deals made, lands seized, promises broken. Could it a retribution for something long buried, a crime forgotten even by its perpetrator? "But I have not slept with any woman by force," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, desperation cracking his voice. "I don't understand." The Dibia shook his head. "It's true, Mother Nature sometimes speaks in ways we do not always understand. But in this, the truth is hidden within you." Everyone stared at the king. The elders demanded answers. "If the land consumes us all, it will be on your head," one elder accused the king. "Kuo Ezioku, say the truth, King Nebuchadnezzar," Onowu shouted at the king involuntarily. The chorus was immediately picked by the villagers, and in unison they sang, "King Nebuchadnezzar, Kuo Ezioku, say the truth." Nebuchadnezzar finally confessed when he could no longer stand onslaughts from the queen and his people. Years ago, in a quest to covert his neighbor's piece of land, he had ordered his men to cut down the sacred udala tree. Its wood was later used to make the very cross at the center of the palace. The villagers recoiled in horror. "The tree must be restored," Asirikoko said, his tone grim. "But to do so, a sacrifice must be made." The king's face paled. "What sacrifice?" Asirikoko pointed to the empty cross. "The spirit you sought to imprison must be set free." Standing in the cold shadow of the empty cross, Nebuchadnezzar realized he had been wrong. His God had not stopped this. The night was restless for King Nebuchadnezzar. As he lay in his chamber, the rhythmic hum of the earth beneath his feet grew louder, as if the heart of Ani, the earth goddess, was pounding with a deep and endless rage. It was not the fierce tremor of anger, but a steady, unrelenting reminder of her presence. No matter how he tried to sleep, the sound filled his ears, a persistent whisper of ancient truths. The voices came next. They spoke in a language both foreign and familiar, fragments of Igbo proverbs, old songs, and chants from forgotten times. They spoke of the land, of promises broken, and of a balance tipped too far. Nebuchadnezzar's heart was heavy. He thought of the sacred udala tree, its wood carved into the cross he had once thought a symbol of salvation. Now he realized it was a symbol of his transgression against the very land that bore him. As dawn broke, the king summoned Asirikoko, the Dibia, and the elders of the community. They met at the grove where the udala tree once stood, its stump a scar on the earth. "Let us do what must be done," Nebuchadnezzar said, his voice weary but resolute. Asirikoko laid out his tools and prepared the divination string once more. The elders formed a circle, their faces drawn with anticipation and dread. As the string was cast, all eyes followed its descent. When it settled, the pattern was unlike anything they had ever seen, a perfect circle surrounding a single unbroken line. The Daibia studied the pattern in silence before speaking. "The circle is the Mother Earth," he said, his voice steady, "the earth goddess who encircles us all. The line is we humans, dependent on her nourishment. To restore the balance, a great act of humility and sacrifice is required." "What sacrifice does Ani demand?" Nebuchadnezzar asked, his voice trembling. "A seed of the Udala must be planted by a child of purity, untainted by the pride of men," Asirikoko declared. "And you, Nebuchadnezzar, must water it with your blood, a token of repentance and humility." The villagers gasped. Such a sacrifice had not been heard of in generations. Yet the king nodded. "If it is the will of the earth goddess, it shall be done." The ritual was set for A4 market day, when the earth spirit was said to be closest to the people. The villagers gathered in solemnity, bringing offerings of yam, kola nut, palm oil, and a branch from Anunuebi tree, a symbol of connection between the earthly and spiritual realms. A young girl named Neoma was brought forward to plant the seed. She knelt before the stump of the old tree, her small hands cradling the sacred Udala seed. The elders chanted prayers, their voices rising like smoke into the evening sky. When the time came, Asirikoko stepped forward with his ceremonial opupo knife. He approached the king, who extended his hand without hesitation. The blade made a shallow cut across Nebuchadnezzar's palm, and his blood fell onto the soil. It mixed with the earth, a symbol of his submission to the land and divine laws of the land. As Neoma covered the seed with soil, a soft wind swept through the grove, carrying with it the scent of new life. The rhythmic hum that had haunted the village faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. Then, before the eyes of all, the seedling sprouted. A miracle, its tiny leaves glowing faintly in the twilight. The villagers fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. The land had accepted their offering. Udala tree is not an ordinary tree to Igbo people. It was an embodiment of nurturing spirit, a symbol of fertility and abundance. Its fruits were shared with love, and its shade was a place of refuge and reflection. To harm such a tree was to wound the very soul of the land. Udala is not alone in its sacredness. The Iroko stood as a guardian of the spirit world, connecting heaven and earth. The Anunuebe was a tree of mystery, its presence revered and feared, its branches a bridge for messages to the gods. The Ofor tree was a symbol of justice and truth, its wood used to seal oaths and call forth ancestral authority. As the villagers returned to their homes that night, King Nebuchadnezzar remained by the young Udala tree. He watched it sway gently in the breeze, its leaves catching the light of the moon. From that day forward, Nebuchadnezzar vowed to honor the land and divine laws of the land. He blended the teachings of the new faith with the sacredness of the old, ensuring that neither overshadowed the other. The Udala tree grew tall and strong, its roots binding the earth and its branches reaching for the sky. Under its shade, the villagers gathered each year to honor the land, to tell stories of balance and humility, and to remind themselves of the power and sacredness of the land.